Is that vote.
Again, my name is Nick Allen, and I'm here with my friends. Anki Yu and I are working on a petition for affordable housing. It's moving around the crowd right now. It's earmarking 0.1% of federal funds that the state collects and is putting that into a housing trust to allocate funds to local entities like our own to build affordable housing. And we know how much of an issue that is right now this year. So can I get some...
We need to come to the West Slope and all over Colorado to talk to people, to learn from them, and to carry our messages back to Washington to get something done about it.
Community, and he's been really helpful on moving forward some things on cattle markets and competition in the agricultural sector. And as some of you should know, I started a campaign to get a public market in Grand Junction supported by the city. Senator Bennet and Senator Hickenlooper both put forward a congressional directed spending request to help with that production. So they've been really responsive to
I could relate to you my first meeting with Michael Bennet, and he's here. There he is. Michael, how are you? Shall I continue, or would you like to start?
Whatever you want. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Well, Chuck's already done your introduction. I just want to.
That's a nice introduction. Thank you, everybody. What a great turnout. I don't know how late. I'm 15 minutes late. I apologize for that. I'm sorry. I try to be on time everywhere I go. And I want to thank not just the mayors, but your two co-chairs here in Mesa County for the incredible job they do. Let's give them a round of applause. Let me ask you, can you hear me, or would you rather okay, I'll use the mic. Let me gather my thoughts together and say this to you. I really believe that the history of our country has always been a fight between the highest ideals that human beings have ever written down on a page. That's the Constitution of the United States of America. And the worst impulses in human history. In our case, the enslavement of human beings at the beginning of our republic. And that decision will be with us for the rest of our days in one form or another. And that fight, that battle is something we have had since before the day of our founding until today. And that's the battle that we are in today. It's a battle. John Hickenlooper and I recently were able to make Camp Amache part of the National Park Service. Camp Amache, as many of you know, thank you, with Joe Neguse, and with Ken Buck, it must be said. We were able to get that done. Camp Amache was part of the internment camps 80 years ago, and I bet you there's somebody here who's 80 years old. 80 years is not an ancient period of time. It's not more than a lifetime ago. It was 80 years ago. 80 years ago, Franklin Roosevelt, that great Democratic president, but he signed an executive order that said we're going to incarcerate Japanese American citizens. And they were given maybe 2 weeks of notice to get on trains, mostly in California, to sell their farms, to sell their ranches, to sell their businesses, to give their loved ones that were remaining their private property so that it was there maybe if they ever were able to come back. And they were put on trains and they were shipped to southeastern Colorado, which then at that time was, in the middle of the Dust Bowl. And we were able to get this thing passed because I stared down Mike Lee on the floor of the Senate and he relented. He just gave up. I was so shocked that he did it, I couldn't believe it. Like, that never happens, but he did, and we were able to get it done. And the next week, John and I, or I guess it was me and Joe Neguse, went there to Camp Amache with people who had been interned in the camp, survivors, actual survivors of the camp, and descendants of people who had been in the camp. And when we walked around what's left of the camp, they said, well, that's where the school was. Not built by the U.S. government, but built by the people incarcerated in Amache. That's where the plots of land were where we grew the vegetables for the kids. And somebody said, that's what it was all about, was trying to give the kids a sense that things were still normal, while we were there. And if you have the opportunity when you go home tonight, look up the commencement address from a young woman who was incarcerated there in 1943. She wrote a commencement address, and she tells us when she's writing it that she's writing it from the light, from the spotlight that's outside of her parents' camp. And she's very clear about what her family has been, what's been stolen from her family, what's been stripped from her family. And the speech is called something like "My Hope for America." And her hope is that America will come to its senses. Her hope is that America will actually live up to the values of those founding documents that I was talking about earlier. And for me, reading that address, her name was Marion, is in a way just like reading the words in the Constitution of the United States. And while those 10,000 people were there, this is the point of this story, while those 10,000 people were there, 950 of them served in segregated units of the armed forces of the United States while their families were behind barbed wire in southeastern Colorado, denied their constitutional rights. 31 people were killed in Europe or in other places fighting fascism. It's a reminder, I think, even in our own state of that clash between the highest ideals and our worst impulses. And it's a reminder, by the way, it was just 80 years ago, as I said earlier. And 40 miles away from Camp Amache is the site of the Sand Creek Massacre, which happened 80 years before Camp Amache, another moment in our country's history. So you go through history and you see that there are wins and there are losses. None of the wins ever come without people having to work much harder than they ever thought they would have to work. My favorite example of that is women in the United States, mostly women, who fought for 100 years for the self-evident proposition. It was self-evident at the time, which, by the way, human slavery was self-evidently wrong at the time that we kept it here in the United States. It was self-evident at the time that women should have the right to vote, yet it took 100 years of fighting and even of physical altercations over and over again for women to get the right to vote, but they did. And when they did, that was a moment in time that sparked an incredible progressive era in the United States of America. That was a time when we decided that we were going to stop appointing senators from state legislatures who were people that went and bought their Senate seats by, through corrupt means in state legislatures. We said, we're going to elect our senators. We have direct elections and women are going to vote. And Teddy Roosevelt became president, and he said, you know what, these big businesses are too big. We got to break them up. And we saw the beginning of the antitrust movement happen, and we had an incredible progressive era that broke out there. It started with the reforms that I was describing earlier. And then we had the amazing, economy after World War II and the civil rights movement, which gives us the worst impulses and the highest ideals all over again. Then we got Ronald Reagan. And some of you will remember him and some of you won't remember him, but that was a time when we took a country that was prospering, where people were actually seeing an ability to participate in the economy for themselves and their families. We were still making stuff here, and he got elected on a very different theory called trickle-down economics. And that was the beginning of the tax cuts for the wealthiest people in the country, which we have continued to do until this day. That was the beginning of no enforcement of antitrust to allow, and it was Robert Bork, by the way, who is the person that brought this new theory of antitrust. That was the beginning, Mr. Secretary of State, of law and economics, and the idea that the people in our economy that should be privileged at the highest level are shareholders over any other interest that we might have. And that was the beginning of all the outsourcing to China. That's when all of that happened. And as a result of that, for the last 50 years, we have had an economy in this country that when it has grown, all the benefit of it has gone to the top 10%. And it hasn't gone to 90% of the American people. And I can tell you, what I'm about to say is as true in Mesa County as it is in any county in the state. The 14 years I've been in the Senate, It's people coming and saying, Michael, we are killing ourselves. And no matter what we do, we can't afford some combination of housing, of health care, of higher education, of early childhood education, if we can even find early childhood education, because no early childhood educator can actually afford to live in Colorado anymore. When I was the superintendent of schools in Denver 14 years ago, all the teachers lived in Denver. I never met a teacher who didn't live in Denver. Today, you can't live in Denver. I had the classroom teacher of the year, come visit me in Washington. She's from Glenwood Springs, and she said to me, like it was nothing, she said to me while she was sitting there, 70 to 80% of her colleagues that teach in the middle school and teach in the high school in Glenwood Springs have 2 or 3 jobs just to afford to live in Glenwood Springs. Now, I don't know if there are any teachers here, but there's some back there. But I'll tell you this, and I know this from having been a school superintendent, there is no harder job than being a teacher, or a middle school teacher. And you have to be a very special person to be a middle school teacher. And I know that, but when did we get to the point in our society that we decided that it was okay, that we would just take it for granted that you had to have 2 or 3 jobs to teach? And that, unfortunately, again, is the result of that economy that I was talking about. And I'm sad to say this, but that economy elected Donald Trump, because there are a lot of people in the country who are deeply frustrated, in some ways rightly so, about an economy that, when it grows only for the people at the very top and never grows for anybody else. And in a way, what that was a sign or a signal or a reminder of what happens to democracies when people don't see any opportunity, because that's when somebody shows up and says, I alone can fix it. You don't need a democracy. You don't need the rule of law. You should expect the private sector to be hopelessly corrupt. You should expect your public sector to be hopelessly corrupt. And that was the presidency that we saw of Donald Trump, and it's not surprising. We see that kind of thing happen all over the world. But something really terrible happened while he was president of the United States, which is he appointed 3 Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court. And I want to say this, we should have never lost the race. I say this in Mesa County, we should have never lost to Donald Trump to begin with. It should never have happened. And look what he was able to do with those 3 justices. So when I tell you, when I've said over and over and over again, all over Colorado in the years that I've been in this job, that our democracy is at risk because we don't have an economy where people feel like if they work hard they can get ahead, where people are losing a sense of opportunity. Now it turns out we're losing our freedoms and our rights already. It happened on Friday. It's the first time in American history that we have gone backwards on a fundamental constitutional right. That has never happened before. And I just want to say to you, the reason for that is the lack of opportunity I was talking about earlier and the election of Donald Trump. I believe we can create an economy that when it grows for everybody. I believe we can create a K-12 system in this country that actually advances the interests of kids rather than compounds the income inequality we have. I think we can fix our immigration system in a world where we have 11 million vacant jobs in the United States and help drive economic growth as a result of that. I think this country can lead all the countries in the world in tackling climate change, but we're going to need to be honest with the American people about how difficult the transition is going to be and how long it's going to take, because it's going to take a while for us to be able to do it. But with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, there is a need in the world for us to lead on this question of how you transition and how you deliver energy to people so that we can keep up the world's embargo of Russia. So let me close, much longer speech than I meant to give. Let me close by saying this. It has been fascinating to watch on the Intelligence Committee as Putin got ready to invade Ukraine, after he made mistake after mistake after mistake, and the way in which his totalitarian system put him in the position to make a really bad decision. It's obviously been a horrible decision from the Ukrainians' perspective, but it's been amazing to watch their tenacity, their bravery, their courage, the way they've inspired the rest of the world, especially people living in democracies who are saying to their elected leadership, do more, do more, do more. There's a moment for us to lead on energy. We have a consensus that's emerging, I think, that everything we told ourselves over the last 40 years about our ability to compete with state-sponsored capitalism from Beijing turned out to be wrong. You know, and all the things we said about what China would do if Beijing entered the WTO, you know, that they would democratize, that they would, you know, subject themselves to the rule of law, that the internet would democratize them. That's what we used to say. And of course, what they've used the internet to do is reinforce their surveillance state in ways that George Orwell could never have imagined, and exported it overseas. So today, with all of that, with what Putin is doing in Ukraine, with what we now realize about China's participation in the global economy, and with our near-death experience with Donald Trump's election, it's totally up to us. It's totally up to us. And because more people turned out in the last election than have ever turned out in American history before, Donald Trump only got one term, even though he got more votes the second time than he did the first time, after his abject mismanagement, I might say, of the pandemic. But Joe Biden beat him. He was the one guy out of 330 million people who could beat Donald Trump, and he beat Donald Trump. And what we have to ask ourselves is, what are we going to do with that great blessing that our fellow citizens have given us? And I think what we can do, as I said, is create an economy that works for everybody in our state and across the country. We can strengthen our democracy by making sure that everybody in the country has the chance to vote the same way people in Colorado have the chance to vote. And I think if we do those two things, when this election happens in November, I want to have those people on the East Coast know that Colorado is out of play long before they go to bed. I want to see it blinking blue, and it's not just my race, but it's every one of these statewide races, every one of these local races, because, you know, if we do the work we know we can do and the work we have to do, we may not win every race, probably won't win every race, but we might just save the democracy, and that is a fight worth having. It's a fight worth winning, and it's a fight, you know, I'll be with you every step of the way as we try to do it.
Is asking for asylum, and we got him here legally.
Are we working on this at all?
We're working on it. Yeah. You should follow it. Okay. Come here now. Say. Okay. Good afternoon.